All right, well, if this morning gave us a little bit to be worried about and discouraged about when it comes to polarization and the prospects of what's ahead, we're turning now, but also some hope, thanks to Jonathan Lee Walton. We're turning now to sort of a deeper dive into the question, thinking ahead around the future of Jewish life, of Judaism, but Jewish life. And we had a gathering of folks like this in November, and someone named in France that, with respect to antisemitism, kind of what happens to the Jews often will affect the rest of us down the road later on. Various ways of learning from what is happening within thick pluralism in this perhaps smaller but consequential American community and Israeli community. So quickly, Alan Cooperman, you've got his bio already in your material. Is Director of Religion Research at the Pew Research Center. And as we discussed this morning, or saw this morning and witnessed firsthand, it's helpful to have somebody like Alan around because he's got all the numbers all the time. And he has a thick history in work as a journalist, national reporter, and editor at the Washington Post, pre-Pew. He is, like Elliot, a Harvard College undergraduate. He has authored 5 books, Mormons in America, Muslim Americans, the U.S. Religious Knowledge Survey, Nuns on the Rise, and A Portrait of Jewish Americans. He speaks frequently on the talk shows and in major outlets, and it is a privilege to have you here, Alan. Thanks for coming back. So we're planning to have Alan speak first, and then Elliot Abrams will follow alongside in helping to interpret some of these data. Elliot, I think, is a senior fellow today in Middle East Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, having served for 4 decades in national security and foreign policy roles. Most recently, he was special representative for Iran and Venezuela. In the Trump administration, he was deputy national security advisor in the Bush administration, and is a graduate not only of Harvard College, but of Harvard Law School and of London School of Economics. He has history at Ethics Public Policy Center. He was a commissioner on the U.S. Commission for International Religious Freedom, board member for the Holocaust Museum, National Endowment for Democracy, and 3 other boards, teaches at Georgetown in Foreign Service. It really is a privilege to have you both here. He too is the author of 5 books. Real quick, Undue Process, Security and Sacrifice, Faith or Fear, How Jews Can Survive in a Christian America, Tested by Zion. Thank you both for coming. Alan Cooperman, the floor is yours.
Wow, thank you so much, Josh. It's a great privilege to be here. I started coming to these things maybe not as long ago as Will Salatin, but pretty darn close. It's been more than 15 years. I went to the first couple in Key West, and I love them, and I always learn so much. I learned so much today. One of the things I learned from Jonathan is to start with a question that maybe you can't all answer. So how many of you have heard about the defixio of Mount Ebal? Oh, you haven't been reading your religious news service daily news accounts. Because, good, Yair's heard about it. Because just 10 days ago or so, a group of archaeologists announced a really stupendous find. We'll see whether it holds up under the scrutiny of peer review, ultimately. But they found and decoded an inscription on a small lead tablet that they believe was found on the site of the biblical Mount Ebal, the Mount of curses in the Bible. And the inscription is indeed a curse. It's a series of curses. But most importantly, it has the first 3 letters of the tetragrammaton, the Hebrew name for God, which I won't pronounce, but Yud, He, Vav, in 2 places on it. And because they can date the lead from a particular mine, and also because of the pottery shards found around it, they believe that they can accurately date this to between 1200 and 1600 years before the Common Era, pushing back the earliest known inscription of the Hebrew name of God by more than 500 years. If we take for our starting point that the Jewish people are inseparable and in some ways almost coterminous with this monotheistic God. What this does is push back our earliest proven date of the existence of the Jewish people by 500 years, giving us an approximate dating of the Jewish people to at least 3,000 years ago. If we think of roughly 5 generations per century, that's 150 generations of Jews. And if we think about 150 generations of Jews who during that period have undergone a lot of trauma and a lot of glory, one could argue and not be laughed out of the room by either historians or theologians, one could legitimately argue that in one generation, the generation from approximately 1935 to 1955, the Jewish people experienced the best and the worst, or maybe in the reverse order, the worst and the best of times in that entire 3,000-year period, in one generation. Experienced the Holocaust, which killed 2/3 of all the Jews of Europe, and experienced what a theologian could only think of as the redemption, the miracle of the establishment of the modern state of Israel. And I say that from a theological point of view, not a political point of view. I'm not taking any political positions here. And the creation in the United States of what many Jews would say is really the model diaspora and the most perfect situation that Jews have experienced in hundreds and hundreds of years. In one generation, experienced both. So I think if we look at Jewish history in that broad way, we can excuse the Jewish people for, at this moment in time, being a little confused and not knowing exactly what story to tell about themselves at this present moment. So I'm going to tell you 2 alternative stories of the Jewish people at this moment. One is going to be a rather pessimistic story. The other is going to be a rather optimistic story. At the end, in true Hegelian fashion, I'm going to try to bring them together, which actually isn't that hard. You know the difference between Jewish optimist and Jewish pessimist?
Yes.
Of course you do. Do you want to tell it? Well, the Jewish optimist says these are clearly the best of times for the Jewish people. The Jewish pessimist agrees. I want you guys we're a small group. You can interrupt me, but let's not take a whole lot of data questions and methodological stuff. I'd be glad to talk about that. But I have a broad arc of story I want to tell you. I would really love it if we could walk through these data together, like one slide at a time. Some will spend more time on than others. I'm going to tell you what I see in them, and so the first story I'm calling the Oi Gewalt story. You know, it's not a good story. It's the negative story about what's going on. And we'll start with the slide. Usually people who tell this story, and this is told often among American Jews today, it's on page 4. And it's got the title, 4 in 10 married Jews have a non-Jewish spouse. Because usually this sad story of where American Jews are and are headed begins with intermarriage. And indeed, overall, 4 in 10 of all married Jews in America today tell us that they are married to someone who at this moment or at the moment of the survey is not Jewish. So 4 in 10 Jews in current intact marriages have a non-Jewish spouse. Now that's of all marriages. If you look back at the marriages by date, when they were married, that's what this chart is showing us. And it's giving us a pretty good indication that intermarriage rates have been rising over time. Now it's true, it's possible that some people have converted to Judaism and there's some other data hiccups here. But basically, this is pretty strong indication that intermarriage rates have been rising. And we can see in the final data point that in the last 10 years before our 2020 major survey of American Jews, 6 in 10 married Jews who got married in that 10-year period told us that their spouse is not Jewish. wasn't Jewish before they got married, is not Jewish today in that intact marriage. And furthermore, we know that among Orthodox Jews, there's virtually no intermarriage. So on the next slide, on page 5, if we look in the far right-hand corner, and you see that dark blue bar, and you go up to 72%, that's telling us that among non-Orthodox Jews who got married in the previous 10 years, 72% married non-Jews. That's a figure that many Jews find shocking. It's, however, exactly the same figure that we found in our 2013 study when we looked at the same thing. The share of Orthodox Jews who'd gotten married in the 10 years before our survey in 2013 was also 72% had a non-Jewish spouse. Next slide. The Jews in the United States who are married to fellow Jews, when you ask them, how are you raising your children? More than 90% tell us that they're raising their children in the Jewish religion. Not just even as culturally Jewish, but in the Jewish faith. When we ask people who have a non-Jewish spouse how they're raising their children, 28% say they're raising their children in the Jewish faith. An additional 29% say they're raising them as culturally or ethnically Jewish. That is, as Jewish but not by religion. 12% tell us they're raising their children partly Jewish and partly something else. Often that something else is Christian, or some mix. And fully 30% tell us they're not raising their children as Jewish in any way, culturally, religiously, or whatever. So, an interesting thing to note there. If you add up the 28 and the 29, you get more than half of the intermarried parents are raising their children as Jewish in some way. More than half. But it's nowhere close to the high percentage of in-married parents. Now, this group that I referred to briefly as cultural or ethnic Jews, let's take a step back and realize that Jewishness, not just in America in the 21st century, but for many centuries, Jewishness has been not just a matter of religion. Being Jewish is also a matter of peoplehood, of ethnicity, of a tribe. And in measurement terms, what that means to me is that Jews, unlike most other American groups, especially most other religious groups, get 2 bites out of an identity apple. What I mean by that is, if I ask someone if they're Catholic, and they say they're Catholic, or they say they're not Catholic, but there's no, I'm Catholic aside from religion. Similarly, can you be Methodist aside from religion? Maybe there's some groups in the United States, but Jews, you clearly can be. And not only do many people tell us this, but fellow Jews generally accept this group, right? You don't have to believe in God, and you don't have to mark the Sabbath we found in our surveys among Jews to be considered a Jew. Okay? To be Jewish, you have to consider yourself a Jew, you have to act a bit like a Jew, and you have to be considered by other Jews to be a Jew. That's the sort of sociological definition of Jewishness. So you get this big portion of people, and it's a growing portion of the American Jewish population that does identify as Jewish, and they don't identify with any other religion. They're not Christians, and they're not Muslims, and they're not Hindus, but they don't identify with the Jewish religion. They only identify as Jewish aside from religion. We call that group Jews of no religion. And these, when you ask them what their religion is, they tell you they're atheist, agnostic, or just nothing in particular. And then they tell us, in order to be classified by us as Jews of no religion, that they have at least one Jewish parent, and they do consider themselves Jewish aside from religion. So that group has grown dramatically. And in previous surveys before our 2013 survey, if you went back a few decades, it was fewer than 10% of American Jews. And now it's pushing 30% of American Jews. It's 27% in our 2020 study. And among younger Jews, it's 40% of Jews under the age of 30 who are in this category of Jews of no religion. Again, they are not identifying with the Jewish faith. Now, furthermore, what are the characteristics of this group? Okay, so they're less religious. Well, of course they're less religious. They're not identifying with the religion. That's what we would expect. But if you look at the table on page 9, you'll see something that for Jewish leaders, Jewish organizations, is perhaps of greater concern. They are not only less Jewish religiously, but Jews of no religion are much less connected in the ways we can measure with Jewish life. It's not only that they're less likely to belong to a synagogue, they are, but also they're just much less likely to say that being Jewish is important to them, or that they feel a sense of belonging to the Jewish people, or that they've donated to a Jewish cause, or that they feel any responsibility to help fellow Jews around the world. Okay? So you've got a growing share of the Jewish population that is disconnected in many ways or has low levels of connection to Jewish life. They're growing generationally. They're 4 in 10 of young Jewish people. And this group is very much associated with intermarriage. That is, the children of intermarriage are more likely to be Jews of no religion, and Jews of no religion are much more likely to intermarry. So this is all like a cascading story that I'm telling you, right? A cascading story of what we used to call assimilation. Jews don't use that word so much any now. The term of art is continuity. One worries about continuity, but it's essentially the assimilation narrative. Now, there's a further element of this that's worrisome to at least some American Jews, and that's also that, and we'll see this on slide 10, Jews of no religion are just a lot less attached to Israel in a lot of ways. And you can see this if you look particularly at the first set of bars and you look at the set of under Jews of no religion, you'll see that 2/3, 67% of Jews of no religion say they are not to or not at all emotionally attached to Israel. And that's not true for any of the other groups. Reform Jews, the vast majority of them, tell us that they're very or somewhat attached to Israel. Orthodox, it's above 80% who are very or somewhat attached. These numbers follow a pretty clear pattern, with Jews of no religion being at the lowest level. We found during the Trump years, and the Trump years may be different than the current moment or previous moment, but when we asked Jews, American Jews during the Trump years, whether U.S. policy toward Israel was about right, or the U.S. was not supportive enough of Israel, or the U.S. was too supportive of Israel, we found a majority of JNRs, of Jews of no religion, not a majority, but a plurality, 40%, saying the U.S. is too supportive of Israel. Let's just hit anti-Semitism. You all are aware of the incidents that have happened in recent years. Our 2020 survey followed the shootings in Pittsburgh, the shootings in California, the stabbings in New Jersey, etc. Overwhelmingly, American Jews tell us there's more anti-Semitism today than there was 5 years ago, and most tell us they personally feel, as a Jew in America, not just as an American citizen, but as a Jew in America, they told us they feel less safe than they did 5 years ago. 3% feel more safe. So the vast majority either feel not much change, or 53% tell us they personally feel less safe. Now, we did try to measure to what extent that actually affects what they do. And we did this cautiously because in surveys, there's this issue of expression of views by saying you do something that you might not actually do. And as people who are very concerned about anti-Semitism might tell us, oh, well, I've stopped going, because they want us to know how worried they are about it. So we did this very carefully, and only among those who told us that they feel less safe did we say, okay, now tell me, in the last year, have you hesitated to participate in Jewish observances or events because you feel less safe? Or have you hesitated and then gone on and did it anyway? Or did you not participate? And altogether, it's a relatively low number, 5% of American Jews who tell us that they actually didn't participate in a Jewish event or observance because of safety concerns. So maybe the anti-Semitism hasn't, although 5%, that's not a nothing number either. And last but not least, that burden, if you will, of anti-Semitism and its chilling effect is clearly not felt evenly across all portions of the Jewish population. There are many people like myself. I am Jewish. I'm also Pewish. And as people say to me, that's funny, you don't look Pewish. But some of us are visibly Jewish and some are not. Orthodox Jews wearing kippot, wearing other things are visibly Jewish, tend to live also in neighborhoods that are visibly, notably Jewish, and they tend to experience much, much more of the anti-Semitism. So that, in a sense, this is the sad story, the lachrymose present, as I'm going to call it, the Oigewalt side of the story. I do want to widen this, though. Most of the trends that we see in American Jews, among American Jews, are also broader social trends and religious trends in America. Very rarely do I find anything looking deeply into American Jews that doesn't have a sort of mirror image in the broader society. So just for example, let's think about the rise of the nuns. So when we did our 2013 study, at that time, 22% of American Jews were Jews of no religion. And guess what share of the general population the nuns consisted of? 20%. Okay. Today, it's 27% of Jews. And what share of the general population are nuns? 29%. Almost the same. And back then, 32% of Jews in the under 30 category, adults under 30, were Jews of no religion, and in the general population, it was 32%. And today, among Jews, it's 39%, and in the general population, it's among younger adults in the United States, the percentage of nuns among adults under the age of 30 is 39 or 40%. So Jewish nuns are almost a mirror image of nuns in the larger society. All right, so let's open this up, and I hope this will be more interesting to those of you who aren't Jewish and don't particularly care about Jewish affairs, and I think that that's just fine. There's no reason you necessarily should, but we're going to talk a little more broadly about religion in the United States in some of these numbers. And this is the section, this is the opposite story. It's the hallelujah story. It's true that it is a very cold and a very broken hallelujah, but nonetheless, they got it. Yes. Anybody who doesn't get the reference, I'll tell you later. I'm not going to sing it for you, though. I don't sing. In the U.S. population as a whole, what are the religious trends? Well, we talked about this a little bit this morning. First of all, disaffiliation. That is, declining shares of Americans who identify with any religious group. And you can see this most notably if we just aggregate all flavors, I don't mean that pejoratively, but all varieties of Christianity. People who identify with any variety of Christianity. Back in 2007, that was 78% of the population. Today, in Pew data, it's 63%. Now, if you ask the question a little bit differently, and Gallup asks it a little differently, you'll get a little bit different numbers. Or if you ask it the way the General Social Survey asks it, slightly different question, different response options, a little bit different numbers. That's not the point. All show the same trend line. All show it going down. And guess what, folks? 78 to 63, 15-point difference. 2007 to 2021, 14 years. It's dropping at 1% per year on average. Now, not every year is exactly the same, but that's the rate that it's been dropping. The share of people who belong to all other religions, all the non-Christian faiths aggregated, Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, Wiccans, and Jews, pretty stable at about 5 to 6% of the US population. What's really going up is the no religion category, the nuns, atheist, agnostic, nothing in particular. And it's been rising at roughly 1% per year. Now, if we disaggregate that line that's at the bottom of page 16, that other religions group, and I'm not going to show the other religions because the lines are all going to intersect, we wouldn't be able to see anything. But separately, I've broken out on page 17 the Jewish line. And that Jewish line, never mind that 1%, because that really is a blip. That whole time, in unrounded figures, it's never been below 1%. It's always been, in fact, usually between 1.4% and 1.9%. There was 1 year in that period when it bounced up to, and it was 2019, to 2.1% in unrounded figures. I don't give the unrounded figures because that would convey a degree of certainty that's not appropriate for the series. But what I want you to see is that is an incredibly stable line. Okay? And it's about 2%. Jews have, as a percentage of the US population, remained incredibly stable for this whole period of time when Christians have been going down as a share of the population and nuns have been rising. And this Jewish line, this 2% line, this is just Jews by religion. That's not Jews of no religion. That's just those who identify with the Jewish faith. Has been stable while Christians have been declining. And if we look at Christians, who's been declining in particular? Is it mainline Protestants? Well, that's page 18. The Protestant shares have been plummeting. And probably sometime around 2012, the share of American adults who are Protestant dropped below 50%, probably for the first time in US history. Now, we didn't have polling in 1750, but there's every reason to believe that the share of Protestants has probably been above 50% for all of US history until, again, approximately 2012, maybe 2014, if you're looking at general social survey, but everybody finds the same trend. Catholics, buoyed by immigration, have been fairly stable, declining a little bit. Okay? If we're looking just at white Catholics, non-Hispanic Catholics, the numbers would be declining rather significantly. But when you add in migration, Catholic numbers are also declining, but not so fast. Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, full name, Paul. We don't abbreviate that name anymore. And Orthodox Christians are pretty stable, like Jews. Now, I want you to see on page 19 just one important thing. I know many of you, or I worry that many of you are under the impression that evangelical Protestants are bucking this trend and have been growing. They have not. Evangelical Protestants are declining as a share of the US adult population. That's what this first, all US adults, these first two blue lines are showing. Both the yes, born again and evangelical Protestant line has declined by 6 percentage points from 2007 to 2021, and that's a statistically significant decline, as has the share of, if you will, not born again or evangelical, which more or less probably equates with mainline, although we didn't ask it that way. Frankly, most people who are mainline, many people who are mainline, don't know that term. They're not, they identify as Presbyterian or Episcopalian, but they don't necessarily understand these distinctions between mainline and evangelical Protestantism. So the interesting thing about evangelicals is that they are declining as a share of the US adult population. Because the mainline is also declining at an equal or greater rate, as a share of all Protestants, evangelicals are probably stable. But as a share of the US adult population, in decline. Black Protestants also pretty stable as a share of the US adult population. Next slide, page 20. Just want you to see how rapid the growth of the nuns has been, and also to disaggregate them a little bit, looking at atheists, agnostics, and nothing in particulars. All three categories have been growing. The share of US population that identifies as atheist is still very small, but it has doubled. It's gone from 2% to 4%. The share who are agnostic has slightly more than doubled, from 2% to 5% over this 14, 15-year period. And the share of nothing in particular has also risen. All three groups are increasing in size. Now, if we think about this in terms of absolute numbers, and this is something I don't really love doing because I'm taking, in some cases, very tiny percentages and then multiplying it by a huge denominator, the adult population of the United States, to arrive at a population estimate. So if we do this, first of all, we want to do it based on a really big data source, like our 2014 Religious Landscape Survey, which is a survey of 35,000 people, very high quality survey. I don't have better data than that. 2014 is the best we've got. We haven't done a new Religious Landscape Survey. Should have done it in 2021, but it was a pandemic, so we've put it off. And I also want to put error bars around it. But just to give you a sense of what this means in real terms, between 2007 and 2014, the absolute number of nuns in the United States rose by about 20 million people. There are now as of 2014, 56 million nuns. And the number is higher now. Right? That is a lot of people. Now, Christians are declining and declined between 2007 and 2014 in percentage terms. Meanwhile, of course, the population was growing. Between 2007 and 2014, the US adult population grew by 18 million people. So you got an expanding base. Nonetheless, even with an expanding base, our estimate is that the absolute number of Christians in the United States declined. Again, two massive surveys, 35,000 people in each one, very parallel surveys, best quality data there is, okay? It could be wrong, but it's the best bankable thing we've got. 6 million fewer Christians, approximately, in 2014, in absolute terms, than in 2007, even though the population was growing. Now, Jews, during this period, notice the error bars. This is page 23. The top of one confidence interval and the bottom of the other confidence interval intersect. So if I'm sticking close to the data, as I try to do, being Pewish as well as Jewish, I cannot tell you for sure that the Jewish population grew during that period, because it's possible with those error bars, statistically speaking, that there could be no change. But probabilities are that the Jewish population grew in absolute terms. And in our 2020 study, our estimate of the total size of the US Jewish population, including the Jews of no religion, is higher than it was in 2013. Two different types of surveys, two different points in time, different methodologies. We could get into all that. But what I'm going to suggest to you is there's good reason to believe that the Jewish population in the United States, if we're counting either just Jews by religion or counting all Jews, including Jews of no religion, is stable in percentage terms and probably rising a little bit in real terms. While again, the Christian population is declining in percentage terms and declining in real terms. And those declines are broad-based among Christians as a whole in the United States. Now, that's sort of what the next slide is showing. A couple of other things, page 24. In terms of the differences, the different ways that American Jews identify what we can think of as Jewish denominations or branches, or sometimes Jews use the term streams of Judaism, so as kind of not to use the Christian term denomination, they're actually pretty stable in percentage terms between the two surveys we did. And again, go back to those intermarriage rates. Remember that overall figure, 4 in 10 American Jews who are married have a spouse who's not Jewish? We found the same number, or I wouldn't call it a decline, but basically the same number in 2020 as we did in 2013. And it's high numbers. So no increase in intermarriage rates between 2013 and 2020. Meanwhile, of course, intermarriage is rising. Intermarriage is not just a Jewish thing. Intermarriage is happening broadly across the country. We have great federal data on racial and ethnic intermarriage because the federal government asks individuals about their race and ethnicity. Maybe not ask it in a very good way. Plenty of problems with the census questions, but at least we have federal data on that. The US government has not asked individuals about their religious identity in the United States since 1957. So that's why we're relying on Pew data. That's why I'm here, because we don't have census data on this, and we don't have census data on the share of religious intermarriages, or the share of marriages that are between people of different faiths. And furthermore, what's a different faith? If a Methodist marries a Presbyterian, is that an intermarriage? Well, maybe it used to be in the old day, but I'm not going to count it as one today. But what about a Catholic marrying a Protestant? Well, Yeah, maybe that counts. So I'm just going to show you if we do it this way, and this is from a survey we did in 2015 where we asked people about how they were raised, current US adults. And we found that 1/5 of US adults today tell us that they were raised in interfaith homes. Now remember that a lot of people are raised by a single parent. So by definition, that can't be an interfaith home. If we look sort of next slide, page 26, just to keep this moving, we also see a strong generational pattern. That is, intermarriage seems to be, like the share of people who were raised in an interfaith home is much higher in the millennial generation than it was in the silent greatest generation. So there's lots of indications. Depending on how you define it, it's hard to categorize. Again, whether you consider inter-Protestant or intra-Protestant marriages to be intermarriages or not. But there's every reason to believe that religious intermarriage as a whole is rising in America. So intermarriage rising among Jews is absolutely to be expected. It's part and parcel. And to put a further point on this, let's try to look at some comparative numbers. Again, the best numbers I have are from 2014, from the Religious Landscape Study. This is page 27. And I've highlighted the Jewish numbers. And you'll note that when we did this, we were looking just at Jews by religion. So it's an apples to apples comparison with all the other religious groups. We're not including the Jews of no religion. These are just people who identify as Jewish by religion. They say, when you ask them what their religion is, they say Jewish. 65% were in married. And 35%, a little bit lower number because we're not including the Jews of no religion, right, who have higher rates of intermarriage, were intermarried as of 2014. Now, that's kind of like right in the middle of the pack. The groups that have the largest shares of new immigrants, Hindus and Muslims, have lower levels of intermarriage. Catholics also have somewhat lower levels of intermarriage. But look at mainline Protestants and look at the unaffiliated. Many unaffiliated folks marry someone who has a religion. Also bear in mind, Jews are 2% of the US population. So if Jews chose their spouses by taking a phone book that was representative of the public and throwing a dart at it, which is a reasonable method. It's not necessarily worse than going online. And just married the person that the dart hit, right? And there'd be a 1 in 50, approximately, chance that they were in married. Right? If Jews are 2% of the population and you're just throwing a dart, there's only a 2% chance, or 1 in 50, that you're going to hit someone who's Jewish. So on the one hand, these intermarriage numbers seem high. What I'm trying to suggest to you is, at the same time, there's actually quite a lot of in selection or in marriage higher than than you might expect. And when you compare Jews with some of these other religious groups, remember that mainline Protestants are 15% of the population. Catholics are 20% of the population. So just the sheer chance of being married to someone of your religious group when you're a big religious group is a lot bigger than the chance of Jews. And yet Jewish intermarriage rates are, I'm trying to suggest to you, not actually that wacky, out of sync, or high in this comparative perspective. Now, what's fueling the rise of the nuns? Well, there's a lot of things, so we can talk about the theories, and I love talking about them. Maybe that's for question and answer. I can go through some of those. Marriage came up earlier, and we can talk about that. But when we think about the rise of the nuns and the rise of Jewish nuns, as well as the rise of nuns in the general population, one of the key factors is change during the person's lifetime. It's not that the parents were nuns and raised their children as nuns. It's that most American nuns, 3/4, were raised with a religion. But since coming of age, they've told us that they've given up the religion in which they were raised, and they now consider themselves atheist, agnostics, or nothing in particular. So religious switching is a big part of this. And I call it switching because conversion is such a loaded term. It suggests all kinds of formal practices and can you convert out as well as, anyway. So we're just going to call it switching. And when you think about religious switching, it's really important to look at both sides of the coin. And I'm going to be honest about this. Jews tend to look only at the leaving side and pay no attention to the coming side. And some other religious groups, and I don't mean this is not a knock on anybody, but sometimes when I'm talking with Muslim friends, I get the sense that they pay much more attention to the people coming in than to the ones going out. And evangelical Christians, in fact, may actually pay more attention to the people coming in than to the people coming out. Jews, for one reason or another, historically, maybe it's understandable, tend to pay attention to those leaving and not to those joining. What I want you to see here is the ratios. And the interesting thing about Catholics, for example, again, Roman Catholics are the largest losers through religious switching in proportional terms in the US population. 6.5 Catholics, 6.5 people tell us that they were raised as Catholic and are no longer Catholic. For every one person who tells us that they were not raised as Catholic and have become Catholic. And the unaffiliated is the reverse. You get 4.2 people who've gone from being raised with a religion to being unaffiliated for every one person who was raised unaffiliated and has taken on a religion. Jewish net switching is almost, as is Muslim, by the way, almost a clear swap. A wash. Thank you, Mona. Almost a wash. Maybe tiny fraction more Jews leaving than coming, but not by very much. So one of the ways we can look at this is as we can calculate a retention rate. What share of people who tell us that they were raised in a religion are still in that religion? And again, just for apples to apples comparisons, I'm going to consider in this only Jews by religion. Okay? And when we do that, what do we see? Actually see that Jewish retention rates compare relatively well. 3/4 of people who were raised in the Jewish religion are still in the Jewish religion. And if you compare that, the Mormons are an interesting case, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. 64% of people who were raised in the church tell us they're still in the church. Now, there are a lot of people who were not raised in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who have entered, and we'll look at that in a moment. But just look at these numbers. You can find your own groups of interest in here, and you can also see in the middle bars what they have become. So most of the Jews who no longer identify with the Jewish religion have not taken on another religion. Most of those people, the vast majority of them, are now in the unaffiliated category. And actually, many of them do get that second bite of the apple. So in fact, Jewish retention rates in some ways are even better than that 75% number suggests, right? One way or another, either as Jews by religion or Jews of no religion, Jews are retaining most of the people raised in the Jewish faith. By the way, look at the evangelical Protestant numbers. 65%, so roughly 2/3 of people raised as evangelicals are still evangelicals. 12% of people raised as evangelicals are now mainline Protestants, and 15% are unaffiliated. Now the reverse, one of my favorite slides, and I added this just for you folks. I don't usually use this in presentations, but I really love this, page 30. What is the problem facing American religion, and how shared is it? The problem, in a nutshell, is declining rates of retention by generation for all religious groups in America. Everybody is in the same boat. Every religious group. So let's look at this and let's start with the mainline Protestant number in the far right lower corner, the silent generation, 53%. What that's telling us is that 53% of people in the silent generation who say they were raised as mainline Protestants are still mainline Protestants today. compared with 47% of people in the baby boom generation who were raised as mainline Protestants, who are still mainline Protestants, 44% in Generation X, and 37% of the millennials, and they're still early in their lives. If we look at evangelical Protestants, it's gone from 69, 68, 63. Now, 69 to 68 is probably not a statistically significant difference, but the difference between 69 and 61 is, and it's a straight line. Black Protestants are doing very well in absolute share of the population, but they face the same declining retention by generation, as do Jews. Then look at the unaffiliated. And there we have exact opposite pattern. The unaffiliated have rising retention rates by generation. What that means is people who were raised as unaffiliated, raised with no religion, growing shares of them are staying unaffiliated in adulthood, whereas all the religious groups have declining rates of retention. Let's pause just for a second on that slide. I really think it's an important slide. And I could show with more, these are just the major religious groups. I could break it out to some smaller groups where we have sufficient samples. It's the same pattern for everybody. It really points home. You got to figure this out. Why is this happening? And it's all religious groups. All right, page 31, accession rates. So the flip side of retention is what I'll call accession. And I use this term, it's a museum term. When you bring in a precious piece of art into your museum, it's an accession. Each person you bring into your group is an accession, whether they go in formally through conversion or not. And if we look at accession rates, find something really interesting. Jewish retention rates are relatively high. Jewish accession rates are really relatively low. And Catholics, fascinating, because the Catholic retention rates, if we just switch back, go back to page 29, and you'll see that the Catholic retention rates are not especially good. But really, you know, they're also not, I mean, Catholic retention rates are sort of middle of the pack. 60% or 59%, 6 in 10 people raised as Catholic are still Catholic. The reason Catholics have that lopsided switching ratio is not because they're losing so many people. It's because of the ratio. It's because they do such a, you'll excuse me the word, but a poor job in that sense of bringing new people in. If you're looking at both sides of the equation here, that we're both, if I were a Martian and I knew nothing about religion in America and I came down and I looked, I'd say, geez, these Catholics, they're not bringing in enough new people. It's not that people are leaving them. It's that they're not bringing in on the flip side. And the same with Jews. Jews, in a way, our problem is not that people are leaving Judaism. It's that we're not bringing in, comparatively, compared with other religious groups, people into Judaism. All right. Those are the two stories. So one story is, oh my gosh, it's going to hell in a handbasket. Things are terrible for Jews, including anti-Semitism, but also assimilation, etc. And then there's this other story. Hey, wait a minute. Actually, things are looking pretty good. So imagine yourself, you're a CEO, okay? And you're CEO of a steel company. Two possible scenarios. One scenario, you're CEO of a steel company and you're barely breaking even. And all the other steel companies are making handsome profits. That feels like a terrible place to be in, right? Okay. But is it better or worse than if you're the CEO of a steel company and you're barely breaking even and all the other steel companies are losing money hand over fist? Well, you'd say to yourself, surely, I'd rather be the one who's doing better than everybody else. But if you're trying to fix it, if you're actually trying to make your steel company profitable, which situation would you rather be in? Because if you're barely breaking even and everybody else is losing money, you got to say to yourself, what am I going to do? Maybe it's like a structural problem in the economy. There's something going on that's affecting everybody. I'm doing the best I can. I'm doing better than everybody else. What do you want from me, Lord? But if you're the person who's barely breaking even and all the other companies are making handsome profits, then you say, well, I can fix this. Surely if they're all making profits, I can fix this. Now, let me ask you, which if you're the CEO of the Jews, which position are you in? You're not in a position where all the other religious groups are growing by leaps and bounds and you're barely holding your own and your people are assimilating, as so many Jews seem to think. You're in the reverse situation. And it's not a great situation. It's a broken and a cold hallelujah. Because you're looking at all the other groups and they're losing. Well, maybe with the exception of Mormons are doing okay as a share of the population, and black Protestants are doing pretty well, and Muslims are growing as a share of the population, but from a tiny base, mostly through immigration and so on. But the big thing, Christianity in America, where we live, the air we breathe, religion's in decline. And Jews are holding their own. So how do we figure so which of these stories is true? And how do we square the circle? So I think the way to understand the truest vision of the story, the one that really makes sense to me, is that there's truth in both of those stories. And I don't really think either is whole without the other. But I think that the thing to really understand what's going on with American Judaism is to look at the change within Judaism. So now I'm going to pull out, instead of comparing Jewish trends with other religious groups, and just look at Jewishness itself. And here's a fascinating thing. And it's on page 33. And the amazing thing about American Jews today is that there is growth, demographic growth, at the polar ends of the spectrum of either you can think of it as religiosity, how religious people are, how observant they are, or of traditionalism. You can think of it as either things. But imagine a spectrum that runs all the way from the least connected Jews of no religion to Reform and Reconstructionists and so on, to conservative Judaism, to Orthodoxy, and to Haredi or ultra-Orthodoxy. And if you array Jews on that spectrum, guess what you find? Kind of amazingly, the polar ends are both growing, and the middle is what's shrinking. So what's going on? Why is that growth? Well, they're both growing, but they're growing for totally different reasons. So the Orthodox, and especially ultra-Orthodox, they're growing through natural increase, what demographers would call natural increase, fertility. And you see that slide, the next slide, on page 34. They get higher rates of marriage, earlier beginning of onset of marriage, or of childbearing, like first child, and more children. So it's not just that their fertility rates are higher, it's what demographers would also call fertility timing. It basically means you got three ultra-Orthodox generations in the space of two Reform Jewish generations. There's that much, and so it's not just that their families are bigger, they're having them faster. Right? So that's why the Orthodox, and especially the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim, are growing in the United States. And by the way, you could think of this as the Israelization of the American Jewish population. Because this same pattern of growth at the polar ends is what's been happening in Israel now for a few decades. And I'm not going to pontificate about Israel's politics, not necessarily any more tzimish or fakakta or meshuga than ours. But, it's not exactly an easy relationship between Hilonim, or secular Jews, who are a huge share of the Israeli population, and Haredim, who are also a big and growing share of the Israeli population. And the middle groups are a little bit constricted and constrained in Israeli politics. And there's somewhat maybe thing is happening here. And if you look at the sort of switching here, the interesting thing to realize, and again, American Jews don't get this, but the Jews of no denomination, those who don't identify with any branch, they're gaining through switching. Orthodox Judaism loses through switching. During the life course, more people who are raised as Orthodox Jews stop being Orthodox Jews. Now, they probably don't stop being Jewish, but they stop being Orthodox Jews. Then people who are not raised as Orthodox becoming Orthodox. So that's why I can tell you for sure it's natural increase, because it's not through net switching. Conservative Judaism is a huge loser through switching. There's roughly 3 people leaving conservative Judaism for every one who's entering. But Reform Judaism And people are always saying how badly Reform Judaism is doing and how only the Orthodox are going. Reform Judaism is net gainer through religious switching, as you see on this slide. All right, I have just a couple more minutes, and so I need to wrap up, but I do want to show you something really important about intermarriage, and Jews don't get this. Maybe they're beginning to. I sure give a lot of talks about it. So the share with what happens when intermarriage rises? You get more children who are the offspring of intermarriage. And in my synagogue in Washington, D.C., which is a Reformed synagogue, I got to tell you, in the religious school that my kids went to, half or more of those kids have one parent who's not Jewish. And that's true in the millennial generation as a whole. You see on the slide on page 36 that if you looked at Jews in the silent generation, 92% of them had two Jewish parents. In the millennial generation, half have one Jewish parent and half have two Jewish parents. And you see this throughout Jewish life. Many, many more kids who have one Jewish parent. Now, intermarriage is rising, but the other thing that's happening, and we've seen this in our data in 2013 and in 2020, is that the share of the offspring of intermarriage who are choosing to identify as Jewish in adulthood is also rising. And this gives way to the possibility that intermarriage, which Jews have been deploring for decades now, and which is the starting point of that lachrymose view of Jewish, intermarriage may actually be increasing the Jewish population. Now, it's not a slam dunk that that's happening, and I'll tell you why it's not a slam dunk. Let's look at these numbers on page 37. This is the great thing about a Jewish survey like what we did, because our survey was not just of Jews. We did a survey of the general population and screened for Jews. But in that survey, we get people who were not raised as Jewish and have become Jewish, and we get people who were raised as Jewish and have become not Jewish, and so we get the whole panoply. And we can do a really interesting analysis where we take as our base for the analysis the people who have one and only one Jewish parent. So that's what this chart is showing. All the people, all the US adults who have one Jewish parent, i.e., they're the product of an intermarriage, by definition. And we look at the ones over age of 65, and we ask, how are they identifying today? And the vast majority of them are not Jewish. So there's a sour joke, and I even hesitate to repeat, but I'll tell you. The joke would go like this. What do you call the grandchild of an intermarried Jew? Christian. And the answer is a Christian. And it's, from a Jewish point of view, it's a sour joke, but it was true. It had a grain of truth in it. But it doesn't anymore, because if we look at the 18 to 29-year-olds, you see an incredible thing that's happened, and you see a straight line what's happened. The blue bars are rising, the gray bars are going down. Among Jews under the age of 30 who have one Jewish parent, a majority are identifying as Jewish. Half as Jews by religion and half not. So I'm going to leave it with one question for you. Why? Why is the share of offspring of intermarriages who are identifying as Jewish rising? Can we take a quick moment and do this? Okay. Somebody throw, Yair, why? Why is the share, someone tell me why.
I mean, why is the shift? I mean, I can't, I would have to talk to all those people, but did you guys ask any follow-on questions?
No, you can't do it because you have to do this analysis much later after the survey. So there's really no way to, in real time, go back and ask people the questions.
I mean, I know the answer based on your slides that are coming up in this packet, which is that it's hip to be Jews compared to many other religious groups in the United States. So when you ask people, what do you think of other religious groups? They tend to give more positive responses about Jews than almost any other religion.
Well, you
so that it's cool to identify and opt in.
You are absolutely right. You blew it for me, though, because usually when I give this, I picked on you deliberately, because usually if I give this talk and I show this slide to a Jewish audience and I ask them why, they give me the answers that have to do with the things the Jewish community has done and is doing. The Jewish community in this country, shocking, I know this is going to be, is pretty well off. And the Jewish community spends a gigantic sum of money, estimated at $900 to $1 billion per year, to foster Jewish engagement. That is, activities by people in Jewish life. Not just synagogues. That's not synagogue. This is everything else. This is everything from trying to get young people to participate in Shabbos dinners through one table. It's the birthright trips that send young Jews for free trips to Israel. It's all sorts of things that the Jewish community does. And usually what people will tell me, Jews will tell me, this is because this change from the age 65 to the age under 30 is because of the good things that the Jewish community is doing to bring people in and to retain people. And it's all that money well spent on that whole range of Jewish engagement programs. Plus, it's changes like now the Reform movement for a couple decades now has recognized patrilineal Jews, Jews who have only a Jewish father, not a Jewish mother, as Jewish. Orthodox don't, but the Reform movement does. And efforts by the conservative movement to bring people in. It's called Kiruv movement in the conservative world. Anyway, Jews give that answer. I also show this to sociologists and demographers, and they always give the Yair answer. So you got it, you just flipped me. You gave the wrong answer, but it was absolutely right from the point of view of a different group. And they always say, no, this is the Seinfeld effect. This is, Jews are funny, they're well-educated, they're successful, they're desirable mates in America, and it's not the 1950s or the 1930s anymore. Jews are not excluded from country clubs, they can buy property any place, it's our country, we're full citizens, we're accepted, and even more than that, maybe even more than being accepted. In some cases, at least in some parts of the population, being Jewish is even cool, or certainly a lot cooler than it was a few decades ago. Another way of putting it is, Jewish groups will sometimes say to me, what can we do about intermarriage? How can we lower these rates of intermarriage? And I give them an answer, and it's a serious, also tongue-in-cheek at once. It's easy. Raise anti-Semitism. The more anti-Semitism there is, the less intermarriage there will be. I guarantee it. See intermarriage, the other flip side of intermarriage is, it's a reflection of the fact that Jews are desirable mates in the general population. So choose your poison. All right, I've still got more slides, but I'm going to, because we should talk about polarization. Polarization is taking place as well in the Jewish population.
Elliot, these numbers, what do they mean?
Well, thanks. First of all, I'm delighted to be here. I tried 3 times to get here. I thought I'd never make it, but I did. I'm not going to argue that any of the data is wrong, but I am going to argue that some of it is meaningless. And we will get to that. I just want to start with 2 points about American culture and American society today and where the Jewish community fits in. I think it's fair to say that we are in a period of American life when there's a huge stress on individualism, making your own way. Judaism stresses the collective. Judaism does not stress your individual fulfillment of your desires for your life. It stresses really what you can do as a member of the community. It stresses peoplehood. In that sense, it's countercultural for America today. And so Jewish continuity in America is in that sense swimming upstream. The second point, just a general point I want to make at the beginning, is that Jews actually emerged into America. It's kind of the last thing Alan said. I would argue only in the last couple of generations, maybe 50 years, go back to 1970 maybe. People sometimes date the escape from the ghetto to Napoleon. The Napoleonic Wars, the Enlightenment, the Haskalah. Yeah, but not really. Not really. Most Jews still lived in ghettos. Most Jews still lived their lives in dense Jewish communities and Jewish neighborhoods. When they came to America, that was certainly the case, and the intermarriage rates, until the last 50 years, were very low. For me, the key issue in American Jewish life is the decline of peoplehood, of solidarity, of that sense of community. It doesn't matter in Israel. Doesn't matter. I mean, the child or grandchild of an absolutely secular Jew in Israel is going to be an Israeli Jew. But that is not true in the United States because only 2% of the population is Jewish. So it is not obvious that the children or grandchildren of people who are secular will be Jews. And I'll come back to that. But look, this is a great country. The power of assimilation is very great. I mean, it is a melting pot. And again, when you're 2% of the population, it's extremely difficult not to melt into the rest of the population. It is inevitable, I would argue, unless it is forcefully resisted. So you see, for example, intermarriage. And Alan's very useful idea of throwing darts at the telephone book, which would produce Jews marrying out 98% of the time. And one piece of this, of course, is the decline of anti-Semitism. It was, 40 years ago, I think, that Irving Kristol said the problem is that Christians no longer want to kill us, they want to marry us. And that's been true. But it's not just marriage. I mean, it's social interaction. It's living in a mixed neighborhood. It's the decline of the Jewish neighborhood. It's belonging to the same clubs. It's having non-Jewish neighbors. And I'll tell you a story about this, which, I don't know, it may shock you, but in 1959, my father decided to buy a new car. We lived in Queens in New York City. And he decided that the dealers were offering really bad prices for trade-ins. So he put an ad in the New York Times to sell our car so he would get the money to buy a new car. And so somebody answered the ad and called, and price was agreed, and the husband and wife came to our house and gave us the check, and we gave them the title. And why do I remember this? It's a long time ago, 1959. Because it was the only time I remember Christians entering our house except as tradesmen, an electrician, let's say. It was a shocking event, such that I remember it in 2022. And I would venture to say the same thing would have been true of our Jewish neighbors. And we lived in a neighborhood that was 1/3 Catholic, 1/3 Lutheran, 1/3 Jewish. But there was no social mixing. Now, I think what's happening now is, partly because of the decline of religiosity, of religion in the whole society, Jews are leaving the community. Now, the contrast, of course, is very great with the Orthodox. The Orthodox are thriving. The non-Orthodox are not thriving. Why are the Orthodox thriving? A higher proportion, Alan said some of this, a higher proportion are married. Women have 3.3 children, which is about 3 times as many as Jews of no denomination. The Orthodox are growing because they have a higher retention rate.
Same retention rate as Reform.
Yeah.
Higher than conservative, but same as Reform.
The intermarriage is almost non-existent in the Orthodox Jewish community. I'm quoting Pew, 2% of married Orthodox Jews say their spouse is not Jewish. But outside, there are some very high rates. And among non-Orthodox Jews who got married in the last decade, 72% say they are intermarried. So let's look at the numbers for a minute. There are 2.4 million children in America. 2.4 million children in America being raised in a household with 1 or 2 Jewish adults. Of them, 1.8 million, 3/4 are being raised Jewish, quote, in some way. 1.8 million in some way. But what is that 1.8 million in some way? Of the 1.8, 1.2 are being raised as Jews by religion. So 2.4 million children living in a house with 1 or 2 Jewish adults. 1.2 million are being raised as Jews by religion. Half. Half are not being raised as Jews by religion. 200,000 are being raised in 2 religions. In America, I would argue that's a majority path out of the Jewish community. 600,000 are not being raised as Jews in any way. Remember the 2.4 million. So a fourth are not being raised as Jews in any way. They're gone. This is a small community. You lose a fourth that way, it's a very, very big deal. Now, the business of Jews being 2.2 or 2.4% of the population, define Jew. What does it mean to be a Jew? Well, we know that 1.7% say they're Jews by religion. Of the 2.4, 1.7 say Jews by religion. Okay, so we know pretty much what they are. But the number of Jewish children in the United States being raised in exclusively Jewish households is 1.2% of all the children in the country. So what is that? Down, down, down. That's decline. 2.4% of the population as a whole, but 1.2% of the children. Another way of looking at it, of all married Jews with children, 60% are raising their children as Jews by religion, and 40% are not. Now, what does that 40% consist of? 19% are not raising their children as Jews at all, 13% as Jews but not by religion, and 6% in 2 religions. Again, decline. Now, this category of Jews by religion, Jews of no religion, you know, you don't have this in Israel. It doesn't exist in Israel. I mean, you're a good Jew, you're a bad Jew. It's kind of like being a Catholic, right? You're a lapsed Catholic, you're a good Catholic. Jews of no religion constitute 27% of those that Pew counts as Jewish. And 40% of those that Pew counts as Jewish under the age of 30. That's a lot. 40% of Jews in America under the age of 30 do not consider themselves to be part of the Jewish religion. There's another way of looking at the children question, the continuity question. The intermarriage rate of 72% among non-Orthodox Jews. These are numbers that Alan just gave. Of the in-married, 93% are raising their children as Jews by religion. Of the intermarried, 28% are raising their children as Jews by religion. Now, it is true, unless you disbelieve the numbers, it is true that the percentage of children of intermarried remaining Jews is rising a bit. Why is that? It's a question Alan asked. It's a good question. It's a very good question. I think part of it is that on the Jewish end, if you married a Christian in 1950, you were out of the community. You may have been trying to leave the community. Certainly the community was trying to leave you. You were, it depended on where you were. The Upper West Side of Manhattan was different from some other places, but you were a kind of pariah. That is not true anymore. And there's a lot of outreach. You gave the dollar figure. But every synagogue you can think of now, non-Orthodox anyway, has all sorts of outreach programs for intermarried families, trying to bring them into the community. Nevertheless, the long-term result, I think, is really unclear. It's really unclear because we know that the intermarriage rates of the children of intermarriage are very high. It tends to rise from generation to generation. I mean, it's not a surprise, right? Most Jews want their children to marry somebody who's Jewish. How do you say don't do what I did? So it's not a surprise that it rises, again, in a country that is 2% Jewish. There is a kind of chain effect, so we need to watch. The children of intermarriage are more likely to intermarry. So what are we seeing? I'll read to you a paragraph from the sociologists Steve Cohen and Ari Kelman, 2007, it's 15 years ago, about Israel. In thinking about why many younger Jews are indifferent to Israel, we need to look at intermarriage and what it reflects, promotes, and symbolizes. The intermarried are far less attached to Israel than the inmarried or the non-married. Intermarriage, and I want to go back to the first thing I said about individualism in America. But quoting, intermarriage flows from and helps produce a more personalized rather than collective view of being Jewish. Intermarriage represents and advances more open and fluid group boundaries, along with a commensurate drop in Jewish tribalism, collective Jewish identity, and Jewish peoplehood. And we see that certainly in the Pew figures about Jews who say they're Jewish, but it's non-denominational. Whatever that means, it does not seem to mean a strong sense of collective identity, of solidarity, of peoplehood. Of Jews who are non-denominational, 60% say they do not feel much or they feel not at all anything in common with Israeli Jews. That's kind of a definition of not feeling part of a collectivity. Among Reform Jews, 60% say they don't feel they have much in common with Orthodox Jews. 37% of Reform Jews say they don't feel much in common with Israeli Jews. Well, wow, Alan's right. One of the most amazing things that happened in 3,000 years of Jewish history is the creation of the State of Israel. You got a third of Reform Jews and 60% of non-denominational Jews saying, basically, I don't care. I feel nothing in common with those people. Pew's numbers, in addition to the people they call Jews, which is what, 7.5 million, I think? More or less. Now I'm quoting. An additional 2.8 million adults have a Jewish background. These adults all had at least one Jewish parent or Jewish upbringing. But most people in this category, 1.9 million, identify with another religion, such as Christianity. About 700,000 have no religion and do not consider themselves Jewish in any way. So think about that. 2.8 million people of one Jewish parent or Jewish upbringing, they're gone. They're gone as far as the American Jewish community is concerned. They're lost. So are these, quoting Pew. Approximately 1 million children live in households without any Jewish adults, but with at least one adult of Jewish background. 900,000 of these children are not being raised Jewish in any way. It's another 900,000 lost. Now I want to make a point about Israel, because I think it's kind of interesting. The most recent Pew data is that just under half of American Jews under age 30, say they are very or even somewhat attached to Israel emotionally. And Pew's conclusion, which I think is indisputable, quote, young US Jews are less emotionally attached to Israel than older ones. So the question there is why? And I would argue that a common answer, which is, well, it's the settlement. It's the occupation. It's Bibi Netanyahu. I'd argue that's false. Are there such people? Yes, of course there are such people. But what we find is, I think, not fundamentally political. Here I quote from Jack Wertheim, who was provost of the Jewish Theological Seminary. What you find, I'll quote in a minute, is the Jews who are unattached to Israel are unattached, period. They are unattached to the Jewish community. That's why they were attached to Israel. It's the people who said, I don't care, I have nothing in common with those people. We're now talking about non-Orthodox American Jews. Seders. Among Jews claiming to feel very attached to Israel, 76% attended a Seder. Among those who are not at all attached emotionally, 39% attended a Seder. An even wider gap exists when we consider synagogue membership. Again, we're not talking about the Orthodox. Those who say they're very attached to Israel, 54% are members of a synagogue. Of those who are not attached to Israel, 16% are members of a synagogue. Giving, charity. Those who say they're very attached to Israel, American Jews, 72% say they give to Jewish causes. Those who say they're not very attached to Israel, not at all, 16%. So these are people who aren't attached to Israel because they aren't attached. They're not attached to a synagogue. They're not attached to the religion. They're not attached. They're just, I would argue, floating away. The percent, again, non-Orthodox American Jews who feel being Jewish is very important to them, 73% of those who are very attached to Israel. 13% of those who say they do not feel attached to Israel. I mean, the numbers go on and on. The Pew 2020 survey asked, rate the intensity of your feelings of belonging to the Jewish people. Among those American Jews who are very attached to Israel, 85% felt, quote, a great deal of belonging to the Jewish people. Of those not at all attached to Israel, 11%. 85, 11. So that's what I think we're dealing with here. Now the numbers, 7.5 million. I don't like that number, I gotta say. I think it is not a meaningful number.
What number?
7.5 million Jews in America. I think it's not a meaningful number. There are 4.2 million Jews by religion. There are 1.5 million Jews not by religion. There are others, To the extent that this is a definition by ethnicity, it's going to fade. Or I would say it is fading. But I want to read you...
The 4.2 and the 1.5, those are adults.
Yes.
Okay, so that's why those numbers don't add up.
No, to 7.5.
The 7.5 includes
right,
children.
includes children. I want to read you the criticism by what I think is the foremost Jewish demographer today, Sergio della Perigola, who is an Italian Jew by birth. And he wrote a critique of that number, of the Pew number. The definitions adopted, especially in the case of children, include persons absolutely marginal or absent in terms of the meaning of being Jewish. The bottom line in the screening questionnaire is persons who consider themselves Jewish because of their family background. Jewishness is defined fundamentally as a property that, once acquired, can never be lost. Listen to the following example. This is Sergio della Perigola speaking. I was born in Trieste, in northern Italy. I left the place when I was 11 months old. My birthplace is in indelible detail in my ID document. My children can declare a Trieste-born father. My grandchildren have a Trieste-born grandfather. None of them have ever visited the place. Most of them don't know or care where the city is located. How significant is this type of ascription? From a social science perspective, it is better to consider the Jews as a socially meaningful collective rather than a random aggregate of people with an indelibly ascribed trait. I think, in fact, if you look, it's one we didn't look at. If you look at slide 59, it's kind of the thing that we're seeing. If you look at young Americans aged 18 to 49, left-hand column, 18 to 49, 16%. 16% Jews by religion. 31% Jews of no religion. 53% not Jewish. Now, we can come back to that, but I want to get to one more topic, which is, so what's the Jewish community trying to do about this? Again, I mean, if you don't care, you don't care. But if you do care, the question is, what is to be done? And the answer is there are a lot of things being done, and there is some statistical evidence that some of them work. And the first one, and I don't know if this will be a surprise or not, camp. Summer camp. I was talking a few weeks ago to a rabbi in Boise. There are 2 rabbis in Boise. There are 500 Jews in Boise. And I said to him, how do you... Jewish kids in Boise can't grow up really in a Jewish community. How do you... And he said, camp. For 2 months a year, they live as Jews, among Jews, doing Jewish things. It's huge in creating Jewish identity. So first of all, summer camp. And by the way, Jewish camps enrollment is up 20% in the last decade. Partly, I think, because Jewish federations are actually saying, hey, camp, and giving Jewish camping some money. Second, education clearly works. I mean, better education, higher quality education, day school education. It's very expensive, though. That's the problem with that. I mean, you want to send your kid to a Jewish day school for 12 years? And the people who usually do it are more religious, more likely to be Orthodox, more likely to have 3.3 children. So it's very, very expensive. Israel. And this is, I think, an interesting thing, because there is this view, and it's not wrong, that Israel is controversial in the American Jewish community. I've spoken to rabbis who say, I have to be very careful talking about Israel from my pulpit. You know, people get divided about it. Nevertheless, we know that the Birthright program works. Birthright is a program that sends Jews, young Jews, to Israel for 10 days. Or as I like to put it, 10 lousy days. It works. That is to say, we have data, Len Sachs at Brandeis University, from 5 years later, 10 years later. Is there any lasting impact? Yeah. Oddly enough, because 10 days, but it's 10 days of being deeply, deeply Jewish among Jews in Israel. It has a lasting impact. People have recognized that and are now building lots of different programs based on it. There's a thing called Root 1, ROOT1. That's a kind of birthright for high school kids. There are efforts to get more kids to do a semester of high school in Israel. There's gap year programs, and there are more efforts to expand the number of kids taking a year before college. And there's junior year abroad, of course. So what's striking about this is, while on the one hand, it isn't wrong to think of Israel as divisive in some ways, I would argue that, in the 1940s, 1950s, 60s, you could even say the 1970s, American Jews, in a certain sense, saved Israel. 1948, Nixon's arms lift in 73. Now, Israel's saving the American Jewish community. Because going to Israel, being in Israel, seems to have a lasting impact on American Jews who did it. And I will close by agreeing with Alan that there's one other thing that we know really works well, and it's catastrophe. And the best example of the day is NATO and Ukraine, right? The Ukraine catastrophe. NATO is nothing like what it was on January 1st. And this, of course, is not a joke for French Jews. It's not a joke for British Jews. You look at the data, when Jeremy Corbyn was head of the Labour Party, and an extraordinary percentage of British Jews were for the first time thinking about whether they were going to have to leave the country. And there is aliyah from France. And if things got significantly worse, more French Jews would move to Israel. Many have a second home in Israel, and send their children to university there so that they are bilingual just in case. I don't believe that will ever happen in America. So I kind of scratched that one out. It's certainly true in theory, but I don't think it's going to be true in practice. So we're left with things like education, camping, and Israel as the antidotes to the kind of diluents in American society of Jewish community, identity, and solidarity. Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Just so quickly, just so people know, like the landscape here. Sergio's terrific guy, great friend, and was an advisor on both our 2013 and 2020 studies, as was Stephen Cohen, as was Len Sachs, all the people that Elliot mentioned. There's a spectrum of their views on these things, and there are people like Sergio who would take some numbers of Jews out of the 7.5 million estimate, say that we shouldn't consider them Jews, and there are others who would add others in on the other side, and that group is not represented at this table. I'm sort of in the middle on these things. Just so you know, Elliot would be on one side, but there are also people on the other side of here. And so Len Sachs, for example, would strongly argue that the 7.5 number is a good number or even a low number, that the assimilation narrative that Elliot has very well stated and factually, and with which I think it's true. What you said is all true. I just don't think it's the whole story. Len would say it's not even the right story. He would say it's just wrong. It's an old-fashioned story, and you're misunderstanding what's going on. So somewhere in between. When Elliot says we should basically write the Jews of no religion out of the Jewish people, it reminded me of the story of the rabbi of the atheists. Mona, you've known everything else before. Do you know the story of the rabbi of the atheists?
I don't think so.
Well, then I have to tell you the story of the rabbi. So Mendel, young Mendel, lived in the shtetl in Slobodka Gubern, and his shtetl was so small they didn't even have a synagogue. They just had a prayer room, a shtibel. But he went like a good Jew. He went to the shtibel regularly when he prayed, and he tried. But after a while, Mendel just wasn't feeling it. So one day he got up and he went to the biggest nearby town, one that's actually big enough to have a synagogue and a rabbi. And he went to the rabbi and he said, "Rabbi, I don't know what to do. I go to the shtibel, I try my best, but I'm just not feeling it. Rabbi, I'm afraid I might be an atheist." The rabbi said, "Mendel, an atheist?" He said, "This is bigger than me. Mendel, you need to go see the rabbi of the atheists." Mendel said, what? The rabbi of the atheists? He said, "I didn't know there was a rabbi of the atheists." Mendel, there's a rabbi for everything. You need to go to Minsk and see the rabbi of the atheists. So Mendel got his mule, and he made the big trek to the big city, Minsk, where he went to the Grand Synagogue. And he arrived, and it was packed. He'd never seen so many people in his whole life, much less so many people davening, so many people praying at once. Tapped the guy in the back of the synagogue, the Grand Synagogue of Minsk, and he said, "Is there a rabbi of the atheists?" And the guy said, "Sure. He's way down in front, down there with the beard, and that, right down there in front." So Mendel made his way down, and he came up to the guy, and he tapped him on the shoulder, and he said, "Are you the rabbi of the atheists?" And the guy said, "Shh, I'm davening. I'm praying. Just wait." So he prayed, he finished his prayers, and then the two of them went for a little walk, and Mendel said, "Rabbi, I'm so confused. I don't know what, they send me to the rabbi of the atheists, and he's davening." And the rabbi says, "Mendel, I'm an atheist, not a goy." All right. Just for the record, goy is not a pejorative term. It's a neutral term for a non-Jew. And what the rabbi is saying is, I don't have to believe, I just have to do the things that are incumbent on a Jew to do. It's actually the same point that Eliot made. Judaism is not a religion traditionally of orthodoxy, it's a religion of orthopraxy. And a person is a good Jew if they're just a part of the community. It's not incumbent on Jews to have great levels of faith. It doesn't make you a bad Jew if you have doubts. Jews of no religion, they're atheists, they're agnostics, but they're not necessarily goyim. And we can see in our surveys.
My argument is, but their grandchildren will be.
Is it an off-road, an off-ramp out, or an on-ramp on to Jewish identity? And let's also realize that if ever there was a time, and I'm not sure there ever was a time, when there was a clear delineation between Jew and Gentile, Yid and Goy, and again, those terms are not pejorative, please. If ever there was a clear differentiation, we are not in that day today. It's a fluid boundary. People move in, people move out, and people are in all varieties of this. And there is Sergio who says, as you do, we should write some of these people off. There's also Bruce Phillips out in California, and California is the least religious part of the country for Jews as well as for the general population. Highest rates of intermarriage for Jews as well as for the general population. Lowest levels of religiosity for Jews as well as for the general population. And Bruce makes a really interesting point. The people of Jewish background in California, that is, the people who have a Jewish parent but now don't identify as Jewish, either by religion or aside from religion, and most of them are Christians. When you ask them what they do, many of them participate in Jewish activities at higher levels than the Jews of no religion. And so Bruce would say, why aren't we treating them as Jews? And I've heard Stephen Cohen say, we should give them an identity card. If it'll make them feel part of the Jewish people, let's give them an identity card. They're also, by the way, people of Jewish background, very loyal, on the whole, statistically speaking, very attached to the state of Israel, even more than many Jews of no religion. So it's a complicated situation. Most Jews we know in our survey, because we've asked Jews this, would not write people out of the Jewish faith for not believing in God or for not keeping the Sabbath. They would write people out of the Jewish faith if they believe that Jesus was the Messiah. So, sociologically, where most Jews would draw the line is once you become a Christian, then you're not Jewish. But then there's another thing that's going on in American Jewish life. A wonderful rabbi, very brilliant thinker, you probably know him well, Yitzhak Greenberg. And he's argued that American Christianity has, since the Second World War, come a very long way in its theological re-understanding of who Jews are and how they relate to Christians. And that supersessionism is basically gone, or almost gone, and that Christians today, by and large in the United States, are taught to view Jews as their older brothers. They're taught Jesus was a Jew. That's what they're taught. Maybe back in the day they were taught the Jews killed Jesus. Maybe that was what they were taught in the 1920s. But in 2020, they're taught Jesus was a Jew. And Yitzhak said the Jewish people have yet to make a parallel move in their reassessment theological of who Christians are. We're still living with Christians are our oppressors, and that's just not the case in the United States. In the United States, as we all know, many Christians are actually very strong defenders of the state of Israel. And they are, as you said, not only accommodating to Jews, but in many cases want to marry Jews. So I think there's grounds for thinking, and I just want people to see both sides of the coin. I don't actually have I'm not personally taking one side of this. I just think it's a complicated picture. There's truth on both sides. You did an excellent job of restating the lachrymose position of what being Jewish is today. I would say, look at the society as a whole, look at the religious boundaries and their diffusion in America, look at intermarriage as a whole. Jews are doing just fine. And if a Jew becomes a Christian, it isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world. People have a right.
Yeah, I realize I'm interfering now with coffee break, but I object to being called lachrymose. I think the American Jewish community is going to end up in 50 years being smaller, but extremely vital and very tightly linked to Israel, which will be the center of world Jewish life and the world's Jewish population. But I do think we have to be realistic, not about writing people off, but about people leaving. It's a fluid society. You just walk away. You don't, slam your fist on the table now and abandon your family and your background. You just walk away.
That's exactly right. And you know that Isaiah Berlin's favorite story? Again, this might get me in trouble. This is not meant to poke fun at the disabled, but you know the story of the Hunchback of Vienna? All right, I guess
Listen,
I better tell.
Get some good stories.
I guess I better tell the story of the
Good dad
Hunchback.
and good
The Hunchback of Vienna.
You're being filmed. Watch it.
So it's fin de siècle Vienna, and two elegantly dressed businessmen are walking down the street, and one is tall, and the other has what we would know today as scoliosis, a curved spine, which back in the day was known as a hunchback. Not a pretty term. I don't endorse it, but that's the way the joke goes, and this is an old joke. And they see some Jews going to services and walking by them, and the tall, elegantly dressed man turns to the hunched over man, and he says, "My friend, that reminds me. I'm not sure I ever told you, but did you know I used to be Jewish?" And the hunchback looks up at him and says, "My friend, that's so interesting. Did you know I used to be a hunchback?"
I have one last line.
Wait. The story is not poking fun at the disabled. The story is poking fun at the pretension of the Jew back in the day who thought he or she could choose not to be Jewish. You didn't have a choice.
I've got 10 versions of that.
The flip side.
But I can only tell them at the bar tonight.
Yeah.
One of the great merchandisers in the history of the UK, their Jeff Bezos, in the 20th century was a guy named Harry Wolfson. Started a huge chain of stores. And what did he do with his money? He donated it to Oxford. And there is actually a Wolfson College at Oxford. So the question that is asked at Oxford is, can you name the two colleges at Oxford that are named after Jews? Wolfson and Jesus.
Yeah.
Let's get a couple questions in and then break at 4 o'clock if that works. Starting with Yair from the Atlantic.
Okay. Thank you both so much. I think a lot of people in the room just got a crash course in the
Just hit that
big
mic,
dispute
Jackie.
in the Jewish community over whether Jewish assimilation or disaffiliation is due to push factors, like antisemitism, pushing people away, pushing them into Judaism, or pull factors where Judaism does things to retain people or it fails and they all leave. When we talk about America, I always find that the conversation feels a little bit narrow because there are, of course, Jewish communities in much of other countries, and there are some that are pretty comparable in interesting ways but have totally different results. So somewhere in Canada, there's like a Canadian Allen. And they did a report in 2018, which I think is called the Environics report. And they found the exact opposite stuff that American Jews find. So if you ask who is most affiliated to a synagogue, right, who is most likely to be part of a prayer group, 69%, 18 to 29. That's the highest of any group. So the youngest people are the most affiliated consistently across all the different metrics. And they're closer to the oldest cohort. The middle cohort sort of drops. It's like this, right? So Canada doesn't have high levels of anti-Semitism, right? So those people are not being pushed into Jewishness through anti-Semites. They have pretty similar levels to what we do here in the United States, which is not very high compared to Europe. Canada does have kids going to a lot more Jewish education,
yes,
which argues that the poll stuff is more important than we might think. But Canada also, because it has lower levels of anti-Semitism, it is pretty cool to identify as Jewish. So many people feel comfortable opting in, which is what Alan said. So I'm saying, so my question is, can we explain Canada? And then we can talk about, South Africa or the UK, but there are a bunch of these other places that have different results, and that sort of complicates some of the stories that American Jews tell about themselves. And I'm curious, Alan, if you thought about that, if you think the Canadian survey is terrible, we won't tell anyone, we'll turn off the cameras.
No, it's a good survey. It's very similar to the UK as well, and actually similar to Jewish communities in a bunch of other places around the world. The United States is a bit of an exception. The one major difference you put your hand on is Jewish schools, but really a simple thing is, what's the share of the Jewish population that's Orthodox? So in the United States, it's about 10%. And a growing share of that is Haredi, but the Orthodox population as a whole has been fairly stable as a share of US Jews. And in Canada, it's higher. And in places like the Netherlands and the UK, it's higher. And that Orthodox and especially ultra-Orthodox community is very strong in Canada. And it perpetuates itself quite well, and the young folks are sticking with it, and they go to Jewish full-time schools, and they marry within the faith, largely.
Can I give you two additional aspects? One, the government pays for that schooling. And in any country where the government will pay, Australia is another example, if the government is paying for Jewish schooling, so it's $0 extra, it is more, there's a higher propensity to go there. Secondly, watch the anti-Semitism. Vicious in Montreal for decades, which is why Jews so often move to Toronto. The European immigrant Jews move to Montreal. They don't live there anymore because of anti-Semitism. They move to Toronto. The anti-Semitism at the University of Toronto is scandalous right now. So it's much worse than the United States, I would argue.
I would ask Alan just to ask the one thing, right? Which is that, there are more Orthodox Jews in Canada, but you have a lot of non-Orthodox Jews who are affiliated in all sorts of ways. So you're saying there's a spillover effect in a sense? Because the Orthodox, maybe they run the schools, and people go to the schools? Or?
It's also where people live. There's stronger Orthodox neighborhoods in Canada. It's all those things. But the Orthodox community is growing, and it's a young community, just as it is in the United States. I mean, if you go to certain, you go to Kings County, Rockland County, you're going to find burgeoning Jewish populations, and they're very young. Because they're Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews having large numbers of kids. And by the way, not just Hasidim, as you know, many are Mitnagdim or whatever you want, Yeshivish and Litvish. And those are big communities that very good at perpetuating themselves. But that's part of this, in the American situation, this polarization, which is taking place. And I'll just throw one quick thing, is that I'm not sure, mostly the trends I see in Jewish life are mirrored by trends in broader American life. I'm not sure that there's actually a parallel to that trend of divergence in the US Jewish community to broader American religious life. That is, neither in US religion as a whole is there a clear argument to be made that the most religious part of the population is growing in size, while the least religious is also growing in size. For sure, the least religious is growing in size, but
how about Pentecostalism?
Well, so that's in the U.S. population as a whole. Could you find some subgroups in which that's taking place? Possibly. I think it's not a slam dunk anyway about it. A lot of it would depend on kind of how you would define the high end and the middle end. There's ways you could probably define it such to find some growth at the high end, but.
Is there any other religious group that has that very high fertility rate that the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews have?
Yeah, and it's a great question, Mona, and the general relationship across the United States and the whole world is that more religious people tend to have more children. Now, there are some people who argue that's a correlation, but not the causation. If the causation could go the reverse, that it's easier to raise more religious people in bigger families. But globally, we find our estimate is that people who identify with a religion have on average, we'll put it, women who identify with a religion have on average one full child more in their lifetime than women who are unaffiliated. And it's one reason why, oddly enough, and we haven't gone into international demographics, but while the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, are rising as a share of the US population and rising as a share of the population in Western Europe, they are declining as a share of the world's population. Because the fastest growing parts of the world, sub-Saharan Africa, parts of South Asia, parts of the Middle East, parts of Latin America, are highly religious. So actually, and nuns as a whole have low birth rates and are aging populations. So the world's trajectory is toward greater levels of religious identification, even as the trajectory in the United States is toward lower levels.
And if you come
And
to
it's
Napa,
because of fertility.
if you come in June, you're going to hear from Philip Jenkins, who's got the great book on this.
Philip makes this argument that the arrow of causality could be in reverse, and it's easier to raise religious people in large families. Right. So that's a really interesting argument.
Will Salatin.
Thank you both. That was super informative. A lot of data there that was corrected some things that I misbelieved. I wanted to ask about a topic that you both touched on, which is persecution and the relationship between that and Jewish identity, Jewish affiliation, Jewish marriage. I was sort of struck by what Elliot said about going to summer camp, and the reason why is that when I was a kid, so I was in a family, a Jewish family. My mother, my parents were sort of lapsed. I remember, although my mother denied it all the way, that she at one point hung stockings on the mantle. But then I was the fourth kid, and at my point, and when I got to sixth grade, she decided to get Jewish again and sent us to a synagogue. Sort of tried to, when I was bar mitzvahed and my little brother was, so we have a gap in our family. But I was sent to summer camps. I remember 2 summer camps. One was the Jewish summer camp, one was the Christian one. The Jewish summer camp was my mother's idea that I was going to hang out with the Jewish kids and get a Jewish identity. I didn't like these kids. These kids were like rich kids from Mexico City. They were a lot of them were mean or messed up or whatever, and I didn't identify with them. That was not a solidarity building experience. The other camp was a YMCA camp. And at the YMCA camp in Wimberley, Texas, I was of that era. I came back to my cabin, and I had a junior counselor in the cabin and a senior counselor. And the junior counselor didn't like me, and I didn't know why. I came back and I heard him say to the senior counselor, "The Jews killed Christ." So my experience, and maybe just because I'm a contrarian, is that nothing has made me feel more Jewish than anti-Semitism. And I don't think I'm any different from, I think about what's going on in Ukraine now, where Putin thought the Ukrainians didn't have an identity, and whatever identity they didn't have, they've got now. And they've got it because the Russians invaded them and tried to take it away from them, right? So I'm curious about what both of you think about the relationship between persecution and Jewish identity and Jewish community building. And in particular, what I would like to ask about is there such a thing, is there evidence for such a thing as latent Jewish identity? So you think it's gone, Elliot. It appears to be gone. There's no manifestation of it, but something then happens which brings this out of someone who knows. All they need is the knowledge that they are of Jewish ancestry.
Now, wait, before you answer this, I want everybody to notice that this is the very Jewish-specific same question about, does it take evil to rally? So I think we all know where Will is coming from.
Small, big. Elliot, you want to start?
Well, I'm sorry that you had a rotten time in Jewish camp. I'm sure you're not the only person who's had a bad time, but statistically, it works. I'm sure there is latent Jewish identity. That is, if you take the most negative view of the results of intermarriage, of the results of a kid not being raised in, let's say, any religion, some percentage of those individuals are in college or in young adulthood or maybe in middle life going to go back. Madeleine Albright's an interesting story, the late Madeleine Albright, having at least ostensibly only found out that she was Jewish in middle age. She did not go back to the Jewish community, but that's another way it can happen. That is, you don't really know about one or another grandparent, and you find out. So I'm absolutely confident that it exists. The question is the statistical one. Does it exist in 1% of cases or 31% of cases? Because that'll tell you whether the community is going to grow because of it or not.
I think that's a very good answer. I, of course, don't know and can't make predictions what share of people are going to come back in one way or another. I also want to say I do agree with Elliot that the decline in feelings of Jewish community, of solidarity, is real. And from a certain point of view, it's a problem. I am hoping that you all will see that to some extent it's also a reflection of the decline of anti-Semitism, just to see both sides of that coin. Ditto on intermarriage. And I guess I'd even say that to some extent, Elliot, I think you exaggerate, but just not enough. Because not only is there a problem of Jews leaving and of declining sense of community and solidarity, there's actually increasing polarization within the Jewish community. And you noted it briefly in the Pew data where we asked people, how much do you have in common? Mm-hmm. And you didn't cite these numbers, but it's only 9% of Reform Jews who say they have a lot in common with Orthodox Jews in the United States. And it's only 9% of Orthodox Jews who say they have a lot in common with Reform Jews. A lot of Reform Jews say they have not much or nothing at all in common with Orthodox Jews in the United States. I would tell you that in a survey we did in Israel, in which we asked people how upset would they be if their child married someone of a different faith. And we found that among secular Jews in Israel, they would be more upset on average if their child married an Orthodox Jew than if their child married a Christian. So that's why I say I worry, honestly, I mean, all these things are concerns. I'm a Jew, I have to worry. But I worry more in many ways about the polarization within the Jewish community than I do about the assimilation narrative. I think the intermarriage and Jews are leaving and the grandchildren won't be in and all that. People have been fretting about that for 40 years, and guess what? The US Jewish population has continued to grow all that time. That's not a new concern.
By your definition.
Yeah. Well, even if we look just at Jews by religion, the Jews by religion numbers have held up recently, since the 1990s. They're down from what they were in the 1950s. But again, so is religion in the United States. So again, in comparative perspective, it's like if you're the CEO of the Jews, so to speak, it's hard to know what more you can do. You're spending a lot of money on engagement. It seems to be working. You're kind of holding your own. Maybe you're losing a little bit, but everybody else is losing hand over fist. So
the trouble is, the steel company analogy is not a good one because there are so few Jews. I don't care how many steel companies there are, but there just aren't many Jews. There aren't many more Jews in the world today than there were in 1933.
39, yeah. This is Sergio's numbers, and they're basically, depending on whose count you choose, either there are fewer Jews alive today than there were in 1939, or about as many, but no one would argue that there are a lot more. And the world's population has, as we know, more than doubled since 1939. Sorry.
Adele Banks. Oh, sorry.
Laura.
Quick question. Do you have the feeling that Jews victims of persecution and antisemitism are coming more to the United States at this moment than before, or less?
I don't know a lot about this, but from what I've read about it, these levels of migration are fairly small, but they're mostly to Israel. So Jews have been leaving France for Israel and so on. There is this interesting thing of some degree of reverse migration. As you may know, there's a fairly substantial Jewish community in Berlin, and many of them are Israelis who've moved to Berlin. But for the most part, there's movement from places where Jews feel persecuted to Israel. And the great wave of migration to the United States from the former Soviet Union really was large to Israel, but it has slowed down. What we do find is that among the offspring of people who emigrated from the Soviet Union to the United States, they are about as Jewish on average as American Jews as a whole. They aren't lower, and they aren't notably higher in levels of Jewish identification. They really look a lot like the American Jewish population as a whole. Many people thought they would be low.
Let's go to Adele Banks with Religion News Service.
I had two questions related to interfaith. One was how successful the outreach that was mentioned of non-Orthodox synagogues are to interfaith families, and having the Jewish member of the couple become more specifically tied to Judaism. And the other is the camps, which keep coming up, what difference they've made in for Jewish children and interfaith families.
I would say first, you don't have to go back too many decades. There was no outreach. There was exclusion. Then the Reform movement became welcoming. Then the conservative movement became welcoming. So I don't know how to judge the success of it, except to say, and maybe this is the best way, in a lot of Reform and conservative synagogues now, a substantial portion of the population membership consists of intermarried families. So they are being brought in. And very often it's in many synagogues, half the synagogue. And again, if you look at the overall intermarriage figures, that's not all that surprising. So I think I would say it is successful, but there is a story. The question is continuity. There's a story about there's a Catholic church and a synagogue next to each other, and the priest and the rabbi are very good friends. And they meet on the street one day, and the priest looks very upset, and the rabbi says to him, "What's the matter?" And the priest says, the church. You know what we have in the tower, in the belfry? Literally, we have bats. We've tried every exterminator in town. We cannot get rid of the bats. And the rabbi replies, "I can do it. I know how to do it." The priest says, "Really?" The rabbi says, "Yes. Bar mitzvah them. You'll never see them again." So the question about that is, the parents want the kids to have a few years of Jewish education and to be bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah. Then what? And I think it's, maybe you have numbers. My guess would be, this is such a new phenomenon that how do you measure it 10 or 20 years later? If these numbers about the numbers of intermarried families joining synagogues are really only 10 or 20-year-old numbers anyway.
So two things. Good. I agree with Elliot on this. There's a lot going on. One time you can see it is quite a few Reform synagogues now, where there are a lot of intermarried families, will do something on Yom Kippur. Sometimes it's mistakenly called an aliyah. It really isn't. But the aliyah is when somebody's called up and given the honor of either reading from the Torah or saying the prayers before and after the reading of the Torah portion of that Sabbath. And on Yom Kippur, a number of synagogues around the country now have started the tradition of, after the Torah service, calling up the non-Jewish spouses of people in the synagogue to be honored. And in my synagogue, there's nary a dry eye in the house. It's a really, there's a very heartfelt thing that the rabbi says to bless these people. And you find in many synagogues, mine included, that it's very often the case that the non-Jewish parent of a kid in the religious school is the one who's bringing them, who's doing a lot, who's very active, and so on. And the non-Jewish spouses are very much accepted. Now, I don't know that that's every synagogue, and for sure it's probably more prevalent among Reform. Elliot gave a list of things that he thinks that Jewish communities and groups could do to increase identification. One thing he didn't mention, but I'm going to be a little bit blunt. I mean, that was a list of the favorite things that people on the one sort of side of the Jewish life would say are the right things to do. There's a whole another set sort of on the left, if you will. I don't know. But one, you mentioned a study that Len Sachs did, a birthright, and he had a control group, and he showed that birthright has had effects. Len also did a study of officiation, which is a very controversial thing, and people that something that generally speaking the right side of the table doesn't approve of. Officiation would be having a rabbi officiate at an interfaith wedding. 20 years ago, that was very rare. 40 years ago, it was unheard of. Today, it's not that rare. And what Len's study showed is that it tends to have a quite positive correlation with later engagement by the interfaith couple in the Jewish community. Maybe not surprising, because you might think the ones that would choose to have a rabbi officiate would also be the ones who are more open to it to begin with. But the same thing can be said about trips to Israel. People who are more attached to Israel are also more likely to go. So it's a little bit difficult to figure out. But officiation is something that is coming. It's more and more in the cards. And another question is religious schools and whether to accept children who acknowledge that they are being raised in more than one faith. This is a kind of don't ask, don't tell policy among Jewish religious schools by and large. If you tell them that you're taking your child to church on Sunday and to synagogue on Saturday, they don't want you. But if you don't tell, it does happen, and anecdotally, it seems to be happening a bit more. This is part of that, I'm going to say, like blurring fluidity of identities in American life as a whole.
So there's an interesting religious question, narrowly defined here, about the role of the non-Jewish parent in the liturgy. Can the non-Jewish parent be called to the Torah? Can the non-Jewish parent hold the Torah? And similar religious questions, and I think it's fair to say, every synagogue differs, but it gets to this very interesting question of, are there lines? And if there are, who's going to draw them and where?
They do, and most Reform synagogues that I'm aware of, the non-Jewish parent, for example, at a bar bat mitzvah does not hold the Torah, the Jewish parent does. And the non-Jewish parent does not say the prayers before or after the Torah, but does say a prayer. But it's not the same prayer. So to someone in the audience who doesn't know what's going on, it will look
come to the bar.
Just fine. It will look just fine.
Right,
like you won't notice.
Let me ask.
But to those
sorry to intrude. Let me ask if we can get sort of three more quick questions in, and then we'll wrap. Okay. Jonathan Walton from Wake Forest, Walter Kim from National Association of Evangelicals, and Jackie Collins from Los Angeles Times. Okay. So Jonathan, you're up. Quick answers.
Okay. Thank you, Alan and Elliot. Thank you so much for just this incredible, rich information. I really appreciate it. My actual question is prompted by your slide number on page 9 about Jewish connectedness, among Jews of no religion. One of the things that I know that's kind of been debated in some of the literature, Alan, around, say, like non-church membership and the like, if that translates into lack of civic participation, right? So lack of religious participation, does it translate into lack of civic participation? I found myself asking the same question when you were presenting this, and then I heard Elliot, and it seems like Elliot was essentially saying it does, right? So the lack of Jewish religiousness seems to translate into lack of just overall civic participation. Did I hear you correct?
Jewish civics, if I can put
Jewish
it that
civic
way.
participation.
So
Okay.
do you give to a Jewish charity? Do you belong to a synagogue? I don't think this necessarily reflects anything about your more general civic involvement as an American.
Okay. And that's what I was wondering if you could speak to, Alan.
Oof.
If you have any, if the data points to anything there.
I won't speak about it for Jews because I don't know. But in the general population, you're absolutely right that higher levels of religious commitment are positively correlated with higher levels of civic activity, including higher levels of volunteering and donating, and that's including volunteering and donating not just for religious causes, but for secular causes as well. It's the chapter in the book, the Putnam Campbell book, American Grace, about why religious people make better neighbors. And there's a good deal of data on that. And there's two theories about it. One is that religion provides the motive and teaches people to be better. But there's another theory to also think about, which is that people who are less connected are just less connected. So joiners are joiners and non-joiners are non-joiners. And so the people who tend to be less connected are then also less likely to join a church, synagogue, temple, or mosque, and the people who are highly connected. But in Pew data, we've asked about like 14 different types of civic activities, and people who are involved in religious life are more likely to be involved in all 14 other activities, everything from youth sports to amateur dramatics and other things. But again, the question is why? And that I would leave as an open question.
Walter.
Appreciate this discussion so
On that
much.
mic, if you wouldn't mind. Kristen.
Thank you for this discussion so much. I have kind of two parts to this question. Certainly, this is a prominent discussion in a lot of immigrant studies. You know, the metaphor of a melting pot that was very prominent in the 1960s. I heard this growing up as an Asian American kid whose parents immigrated during that time. America's a melting pot, and there's a movement away from that to this metaphor of a salad bowl, not a melting pot. That there's preserved identities that are mixed together, but they're nonetheless distinct. Certainly within the Asian American community, there's a sense of, you know, second generation really tries to assimilate, but starting with the third and fourth generation, there's a resurgence of a discovery of identity. So this whole melting pot versus salad bowl, this gets to, Will, your latent identity question. Observation, if there's a latent identity that gets activated, and I also want to say I'm so sorry for your experience at that camp. I mean, that is horrifying to me. So part of the question is, in what sense is this a dynamic that could be in a cycle appearing within the Jewish community? That's one. The second part is, a lot of discussion is revolved around this notion of, you know, people leaving or shifting from higher rates of belief to maybe just ethnic identification of Jewishness rather than religious or some other cultural marker, or just leaving it and not identifying as Jewish at all. What is replacing it? In other words, is there an identifiable identity marker that is actually a draw from religious belief and identification to something else? So not just a push, but is there an active pull that is statistically identifiable?
Statistically or anecdotally?
Let me try again to answer this one broadly and not just about Jews. We have the rise of the nuns, and we often get this question. So what is it that nuns positively are doing? And many religious people, I think possibly with somewhat rose-colored glasses, really strongly want to believe that while nuns are not conventionally religious, they must be highly spiritual and doing something else that has to do with spirituality as a replacement. And I have to say that if that's happening, I don't have a measure and can't see the data that shows it. In fact, all the sort of measures of various kinds of generic spirituality, as well as what you might think of as New Age spirituality, belief in reincarnation, belief in astrology, belief in karma, belief in spiritual energy and physical objects like crystals and stuff, all that stuff is higher, as high or higher among people who are conventionally, traditionally religious as it is among the spiritual but not religious or the nuns. And in fact, the nuns, on the whole, while it's true that they aren't devoid of religious beliefs or practice, a majority believe in God, for example, they are notably lower on conventional religious measures and no higher, and in many cases lower, on all these other measures. And maybe we're not measuring the right thing, but I don't see replacement going on. And what we showed in our Jewish survey, I'm sorry, I'm giving these long answers, but what we showed in our Jewish survey is that the same thing is true. And this is really, I'm going to sing Eliot's song here for a second. Jews by religion do more of all the culturally Jewish activities. You can see them on page 39 and 40, where we asked about a bunch of these things. You know, do you read Jewish literature? Do you watch Jewish shows on TV? Do you go to Jewish film festivals? All these things. The conventionally religious Jews do more of those across the board than cultural and ethnic Jews do, those who are not conventionally religious. And in fact, it correlates very strongly with measures of religiosity. The most observant Jews do all the cultural stuff, eating Jewish foods, all that stuff, do them more than that. So I don't see, basic answer is, I don't see evidence of replacement or substitution. They just do less.
I was asking the question a bit more broadly than just a religious replacement. Is there some other ideological replacement? Is there, a general identifiable trend toward a certain political view, or
there is some. It's interesting among Jews. You can trace. You correct me if you think this is wrong. You can trace, unsurprisingly, attitudes, for example, toward Israel sometimes orthodox, most pro-Israel, conservative, a little bit less, reform, less. Then you get to people who've, of Jewish background, and sometimes they are more pro-Israel and why is that? Because they've left entirely, they're just plain old Americans, and most Americans are pro-Israel. So what happens is, they take on some of the sort of just general characteristics of 350 million people. I think one of the problems here in answering your question as it pertains to Jews is this double identity. Jews as a religion, Jews as ethnicity. So what are you leaving? What are you returning to?
We asked a battery of questions in our 2013 and 2020 studies for Jews. We asked them, what's essential to being Jewish to you? And what's important but not essential, what's not important. And the number one answer that most Jews across the board give is remembering the Holocaust. That's the one that the most give as the answer. Won't surprise you that non-Orthodox Jews, relatively low numbers, say that observing traditional Jewish law is essential or even important. Now, among the Orthodox, that's very high. But among non-Jews, it isn't. So what is it that not non-Jews, but non-Orthodox Jews. So what is it that non-Orthodox Jews, and particularly Jews of no religion, say is essential to their being Jewish? Besides remembering the Holocaust, there are a few things. And one of them is working for justice and equality in society. That's the wording we used in the question. It gets very high levels. Then Meir Silovitchik, who's a rabbi and I think a good friend of Eliot's, brilliant, relatively young rabbi, He has dismissively called that the Judaism of the secular, the Judaism of the assimilated. He called that the Judaism of the assimilated, working for justice and ethics in society. So, I don't know. You can see both sides of the coin.
Well, I think with that, all right, Carl Cannon. Well, all right, with that, we're going to mostly wrap. Have at it, Carl, and then we're going to wrap. Yeah, great.
Appreciate it. So, this organization called Jews for Jesus. Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask you, Alan, and then you. So, if I understand you right, Alan, you think that's an interesting organization and perhaps benign, and you really think it's an oxymoron.
Oh no, I would.
Wait. And you think it's an oxymoron? Am I right?
Well,
Jews for Jesus.
Yes, I think it's an oxymoron.
Okay.
But B, I don't think it's benign. I think missionary work.
You don't get that part.
Missionary work among Jews is not benign.
You only get the first part. You think it's an oxymoron. You think it's benign.
Well, I don't take public positions on these things. It's not that'd be out of my role to condemn or approve any religious group. But I will tell you that Jews do not think Jews for Jesus are Jewish. Jews would write Jews for Jesus out of Judaism. And we do not, in our surveys, count. The broader group is known as Messianic Jews. Jews for Jesus is just one particular organization. But if people tell us that they both believe in Jesus or are Christian and Jewish, then we don't count them in our survey. We have data on them, but we don't count them as Jewish because we've been told in our surveys that most Jews would not consider them Jewish. So maybe that answers your question.
No, I was going by what you said earlier. You didn't seem bothered by it.
What I said, and let me be careful because I probably will get in trouble for this. I said, look, if a Jew chooses to become a Christian, they choose it. They're not forced. They're not persecuted into it. If they choose of their own free will to become a Christian, maybe it's not the worst thing in the world. I mean, I'm not approving it. I'm not calling for it. But in the panoply of American life, if you're a Christian, Carl, and a Christian becomes a Jew, is that a benign thing? Is that a terrible thing? Are you going to condemn it? So, right. I know a lot of Christians whose children have become Jewish, married into Jewish families and become Jewish. And those families have not written off their kids or their grandkids. They accept them. Just in the way, there's a lot of parallels to a lot of other groups in American society in interracial and ethnic marriage, in attitudes toward LGBT, et cetera. I think what I'm trying to say, I'm just trying to show the flip side of this is that, yes, we can, as Jews and Jewish organizations, we can lament the assimilation or the loss of people to Judaism. But we ought to see that is the flip side of the freedom that we have in this society and the acceptance of Jews.
Now, marriages among Republicans and Democrats, that's a different
and that's what's become incredibly rare. Political polarization worries me much more.
Well, that's a wonderful way to tie into this morning's conversation. And there's a slide, like 41 or so. So if it gets boring this afternoon, you got 20 slides to work with. You can just go see Alan. Thanks so much, Elliot and Alan. Appreciate it.